with Rob Gould, the Cotswold Forager. One of the things that I picked up from talking to you was during the cocktail cabaret that I hosted for the Association of Foragers annual meetup. And what you did was something that took me a long time to master, and that's that you were picking up cocktails and drinking a little bit and going, okay, that needs a bit more bitterness, that needs a little bit more acidity, that needs whatever to balance it. How did you get those taste buds to do that? Where did that come from? Is that instinctive? Is that learned? So for me, just to give you a bit of context and give you time to think of an answer, was when I wrote a book called Brewing Britain that was republished as The Perfect Pint, I tried about 1,000 beers over the course of a year and a half or so. And it was a daily process of drinking a bit and pulling out the flavours and going, okay, this is like this. And then I noticed that then transfers into food and into wine, into whatever. So it gave me a grounding, if you like, a foundation course in flavours. What was your foundation course in flavours? Like, have you worked in restaurants? Have you...
No, I've always liked food. I've always enjoyed food. And I grew up in a traditional house, 2.4 children. We didn't have 2.4 children. That would be weird.
So you've got,
I've got like
just less than half a sister.
2/3 of a third of a brother, And my mum was always really keen to teach us as kids about cooking. But I think she wanted us to be really at home with it. So we'd always have the recipe books out and we'd always reference them, but we didn't necessarily always cook from the recipe books. We used them as inspiration, rather than as a checklist of now slice your onions into half centimetre dice. So that was the way I was sort of brought into cooking, and so I guess my cooking journey went on from there. And I'd find something that I like the look of in a restaurant or somewhere that I'd been to or in a shop, and I'd go and look for 3 or 4 different recipes of how to make it, and then I'd completely ignore all of them and I'd have a gist of what was in them, and I'd build it, and then I'd be tasting it to get the idea of what would work and what wouldn't. And sometimes you can taste it when you're cooking it and work out what you need to add in extra. Sometimes you don't get the idea until afterwards, but then you've got that reference point for the next time of going, well, last time when I cooked this it wasn't quite sweet enough at the end, so I'll slightly over sweeten it to what I think it needs to be now, because by the time it's ready then that sweetness will have receded because the bitterness and the sourness and the umami will have come through, but the sweetness will stay at about the same point. So I guess it came from there, and I mean now it's got to the ridiculous point where I've probably got bookshelves with 300 cookery books on at home, having literally just admitted that I don't cook from recipes. But what I'll do is, if I come across something that I've never come across before, I'll go and look in the recipe books and I'll find 3 or 4 or 5 recipes for what I want to cook, and I'll look through them and I'll go, oh, this one uses lemon juice, but this one uses vinegar, oh, so they're just using it as an acid, and this one uses palm sugar, and this one uses
honey,
molasses or honey, but this one that doesn't use molasses adds in something else to give that slightly earthy flavour. And it's just that, I think it's just that thing of just...
It's using it as a map, isn't it? As a map.
Yeah, it's a guide.
Rather than directions.
Yeah, and I think I really got into it. There's a guy who I got given his book when I was at college, called Nigel Slater. And I really loved his Real Food, I think it's Real Food book, where basically you've got the recipe, and then at the bottom of the recipe it says, if you haven't got this, try putting this in instead. If you haven't got this, put this in instead.
I've got tender, and it just says, it gives you an idea of how to use an aubergine in the kitchen, and gives you a few different flavours to go with.
And I think that's the kind of chef, cook that I am. We've got a cupboard at home full of ingredients. My partner, and hopefully she'll forgive me for saying this, if she can't find the things in the fridge, she'll say, oh, we've got nothing to cook. I could cook 50 meals from what's not in the fridge and what's in the larder. And it's just that built up memory bank of flavours that work together, and textures that work with those flavours, or textures that might work with those flavours, and things that you would need to add in to lift them. And I think bringing it back to the foraging, that's where which I realised wasn't where you started from. But that's where I came at it from, of going, we've got all these flavours that I kind of know, but I've not really come across before.
Yeah.
But they're very reminiscent of other things. So how can I make use of them? And there's no point in going, well, it tastes a little bit like this, so make this recipe, but put this in instead.
I mean, that's what's hard about writing foraging books as well, is that there's often not an in of what this tastes like, and we use things like, it's a bit like spinach or a bit like carrot, and it's not. It's a bit like, and then your frame of reference is a bit like hogweed. Yeah. And you can't use that as a bit like hogweed.
Yeah. So it's for another forager, you can say it's a bit like hogweed, but someone who's just starting out, you can't say that. No. And it becomes really difficult. And you find yourself saying to people, like, as you said, it tastes like spinach. And I always think, like nettles, it tastes like spinach. But I think nettles far superior to spinach. Far. But that's people's reference point.
And again, there's a terroir, isn't there? Like nettles that I've been picking some by the estuary, and there's a kind of saltiness to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you pick nettles from like this heavy clay woodland that we're in. They're really earthy and quite bitter. So they work in certain dishes. But if you pick them out from in the meadows, around the edges of the meadows near the farms, they're much more sweeter, more tender, much more succulent. They don't stand up to cooking so well.
So I think we're almost at the point where we can start suggesting to the general public, if you don't like a wild food, try picking it from somewhere else.
Try and gather it from somewhere else, absolutely. And I mean, that's the thing. And also, if you don't like a certain part of a wild plant, then as long as you do your research to check the edibility of other parts of the plant, you may find that there are other parts of the plant that give you flavour attributes that are similar but that you actually like.
So Alexander's decent. So it's around now, it's February, and the seeds are still there from last year, and they're hanging around, and you could grind them up and use them as pepper, and they've got that kind of perfumey taste. But the root, we had the roots glazed at the annual general meeting.
And they were phenomenal.
The annual meet-up, and they were phenomenal, and they didn't taste like this. They just still had a hint. But they weren't the same as the seeds, and they weren't the same as the leaves. So,
no.
You know, prime example.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, in that you've got to obviously be aware of the rules of foraging, the 4Fs.
Yeah, don't pick it by the root.
Pick it by the root. But the guy who got those got permission. It was only from his own land. So
it's considered an invasive species by some people. Quite like you pulling it out. They've got parties coming up to the Downs in Bristol where they pull it out of the ground.
Okay,
like,
so you'll be there going.
That's my food.
So you should be there going with the roots. Taking the roots. So I'm not a big fan of the actual leaves of Alexander's.
Which I've just given
you've just given me. Say it on camera, so it's there for everyone to see. I always find they've got a slight sort of petrochemically note to them, and I think the perfume note comes through a lot more in the leaves than it almost even does in the seeds.
So if you try the very young shoots, the first shoots,
so the ones that you've given me, I'm hoping that I'll get something different from those.
So there is a slightly different.
So the ones later in the year, which is ironic, because as we've been walking around, we've been trying the wild garlic. When you get the wild garlic when it's very young and fresh, the flavours are almost at the most intense that it'll ever be.
And it's just literally this size, aren't we? We're doing 2 centimetre growth there.
I'm talking like, wild garlic leaves way smaller than that. Smaller than that still. Most people will pick their wild garlic leaves when they're sort of so long, inch across at the centre, and they're fab, especially if they're still young and fresh. But if you want a really punchy flavour, you get these. You've got to be really confident in what you're picking. But you pick your very, very young wild garlic leaves, and the flavour in there is so ridiculously intense, and it's almost, you almost get a spicy heat from them, don't you? It's almost like some sort of wasabi, mustardy, almost chili-like heat.
I'm wondering about pounding that up and mixing that in with something fermented. You know, using that as a kind of massaging that into kimchi, you know.
For sure, absolutely. Or even into a, like you say, into a ferment, just to brighten it up and add that really strong, intense heat through.
Because I've used older ramps in some countries, you know, ramps in the States it gets called. Although I did hear it's not as prolific in the States, so there's a kind of frowned on a little bit in some of the States to pick it.
I was talking to a really interesting lady, so I was at a Fermenters Guild meet just after the Association of Foragers meet. I'm an interesting guy. Boring, maybe. And she's written a book about the history of different ferments. And I was talking to her about, you know, the apocryphal tale of how in America, in certain states, they've almost entirely eradicated ramps.
Right.
Because in the States, from what I've heard and from what she verified, they will dig up the ramps, and they'll harvest the root section and the bulb section, and they'll literally cut the top off and discard it. That's the waste product. Whereas we gather the top, and if you're being sustainable and ethical and sensible about it, you'll take 2, maybe 3 leaves.
Yeah,
from
I
a
like
plant.
to just sort of make it not look like you've been
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
Just go around like that.
And then those are what you use, and you leave behind the majority of the plant with the roots and the bulb, and it regrows. In certain states in America, they've almost entirely eradicated ramps by digging up the roots.
Yeah, because I've read books that tell you, and often these things, and this is where it comes back on us foraging teachers, I think, often these links will come back to one foraging teacher.
Yeah.
Like, so there was a book by a guy called C.J.J. Berry about winemaking.
Yeah.
And I think it was cowslip. He recommended a cowslip
Yeah.
wine, and then it's now rare.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, and you can't find it's coming back.
Yeah, yeah. Although I was going to say, come back to the Cotswolds in late April, May through June. There are hilltops where absolutely inundated with cowslips.
This is what it used to be like.
Yeah, yeah.
apparently.
Back to how it should have been.
And this one writer with a best-selling homebrew book.
Yeah, yeah.
So so I'm writing about wild food at the moment. I'm writing a book for the National Trust, and I'm really aware of this.
Yeah,
hyper
yeah.
aware, and I hope I don't mess up, because it has ramifications if the book's
Absolutely.
successful.
And it's having that awareness, which as a forager, hopefully you'll have already.
hopefully.
Whereas
No,
this
well,
guy,
we do.
I don't know this guy's background, but
No, yeah,
as a brewer, it's a different.
And he wrote the book in the 60s.
Yeah, yeah.
He
When
knows.
they were prolific,
Yeah.
when cowslips were prolific. So
And when we didn't have quite the same way of looking at the world.
yeah, yeah.
The world was there to serve us.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, what was this first question? It was about you being experimental, was it? Okay, if you remember, we've gone off on tangents.
Yeah. About.
Yeah.
Well, no.
I think we've almost come back.
We've gone full circle.
I don't know what this video will be titled, but it will be whatever we've just
rambling.
whatever we've just spoke about.
Yeah.
So that's video 2. Yeah.
And that was 13 minutes.
That was about learning about